A single human brain weighs just about 3 pounds. But think about this for a second. Throughout history, the decisions made within a single ruler's mind have quite literally carried the weight of millions of lives. Hello and welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into something absolutely fascinating: the sheer, unmatched influence of a single human life. Over the centuries, powerful kings and rulers have risen up to build these massive empires, win legendary battles, and fundamentally shape the very future of civilization itself. So we're going to examine exactly how the leadership, the ambition, and sometimes just the split-second decisions of a few incredibly powerful individuals have changed our world forever. We'll look at how they pulled it off, the specific tools they used, and the lasting legacies they left behind for all of us.
It really brings up a massive question, doesn't it? How exactly does one single person change history? I mean, when you consider the sheer scale of the globe and the billions of people who have walked this earth, it feels almost impossible that one individual's choices could alter the destiny of millions. Yet, when we look at the historical record, it shows us time and time again that a single mind, a single burning ambition, or even a sudden change of heart at the very top of a power structure can literally redraw maps and rewrite the rules of human existence. Okay, let's dive into this. When we trace the blueprints of historical change, we generally see two distinct paths emerge, which we can basically think of as the sword and the pen. On one side, you have rulers who expanded their influence primarily through the sword, meaning they built these immense empires through brute military conquest, legendary battles, and rapid, aggressive territorial expansion. But on the other side, we have the pen. These are the rulers who changed society from the inside out through profound structural reforms, massive cultural shifts, and the stroke of a pen creating new laws. And as you'll see, some of the absolute most influential figures in history actually wielded both to cement their legacy. So let's start by looking at Section 1, Masters of Global Conquest, which is really the traditional path to ultimate power.
Let's move to our timeline and see how this builds. We are spanning thousands of years here, yet the core ambition remains exactly the same. We kick things off way back in the 4th century BC with Alexander the Great of Macedonia. This is a man who, astonishingly, never lost a single battle in his entire life. Just let that sink in. Then we leap forward to the year 1206 with the rise of Genghis Khan. His conquests were so incredibly vast that the reforestation of the lands he depopulated actually temporarily cooled the Earth's climate. Crazy, right? Finally, we land in the early 19th century with Napoleon Bonaparte. So we have three distinctly different eras, three vastly different parts of the world, but they are all entirely connected by an absolute, unmatched mastery of military expansion.
Alexander the Great didn't just win a few battles against the mighty Persian Empire. He permanently installed Greek culture by building these massive garrison cities, dozens of them named Alexandria, naturally, all across Asia, Egypt, and the Middle East. By the time he died at just 32 years old, he had fundamentally rewired the entire ancient world. Then you have Genghis Khan. He didn't just unite some Mongol tribes and launch raids. He utilized this revolutionary horseback postal system to maintain absolute communication and total control over vast distances. That created the largest contiguous land empire in human history and completely accelerated trade along the Silk Road. And Napoleon Bonaparte? Well, his sheer military brilliance completely reshaped the political borders of Europe in ways we literally still see echoes of today. So, military brilliance can undeniably build an empire. That much is clear. But what happens when a conqueror actually realizes the true human cost of all that war? What happens when the person holding the sword suddenly looks around at the absolute devastation they've caused and decides they can no longer justify the bloodshed? This brings us to Section 2, the pivot, focusing on Ashoka's awakening and his incredible transition from military success directly into ancient Buddhism. We are talking about Ashoka the Great. He was a renowned ruler of the Maurya Empire in India. Now, much like the men we just discussed, Ashoka was initially famous for his absolutely ruthless military success. But his story takes this radical, historic turn because of one very specific, very tragic event: the Kalinga War. This wasn't just your standard ancient battle, it was an exceptionally brutal slaughter. Historical sources estimate that up to 100,000 people died, with countless more violently displaced from their homes. The sheer terrifying scale of this destruction triggered a massive, profound moral crisis in Ashoka. He was devastated. He didn't just want a temporary peace treaty, he desperately needed a framework for his own redemption.
and he found exactly that in ancient Buddhism. He was drawn specifically to its core tenet of ahimsa, or nonviolence. For Ashoka, Buddhism offered a clear path to replace the bloody conquest of territory with the peaceful conquest of self. It was basically a radical philosophical antidote to his deep trauma and immense guilt.
This internal awakening led to a complete and total systemic transformation of how he ruled his empire. First, deeply affected by the staggering suffering he personally witnessed at Kalinga, he completely abandoned his lifelong military ambitions, just stopped them cold. Second, he fully embraced peace and Buddhism as his new guiding light. And third, he actually dismantled his massive war machine to enact what he called his Dhamma, his brand new ethical framework. Instead of sending out armies to conquer his neighbors, he started sending out medical envoys. He ordered the planting of medicinal herbs, he had wells dug along dusty trade routes just for exhausted travelers, and he fundamentally redesigned his entire state apparatus to serve the vulnerable rather than just feeding a giant military complex. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what kind of legacy he ended up leaving behind. This quote directly from our source highlights the sheer magnitude of his pivot. And, fun fact, we actually know so much about this because of Ashoka's famous rock and pillar edicts. These were massive stone carvings spread all across his empire. They were essentially the ancient world's very first public billboards for human rights. By recording his embrace of peace, justice, and welfare for literally everyone to see, Ashoka's legacy was entirely rewritten. He went from being a feared, ruthless warlord to an absolute pioneer of social welfare. And this matters profoundly to us today because Ashoka proved thousands of years ago that institutional empathy is actually possible. He showed the world that a massive, powerful state can run on welfare and tolerance just as efficiently as it runs on warfare.
Which leads us perfectly right into Section 3, Power Through Cultural Reform. How do leaders change the world without just relying on military conquest?
When we examine rulers who primarily wielded the pen to change society through reform and culture, Charlemagne is a perfect starting point. Operating in Western Europe during the 8th and 9th centuries, he became known as the father of Europe, and his ultimate tool of change wasn't just battlefield tactics. He intentionally strengthened education and drastically improved local administration. He basically laid the very civic foundations for medieval European civilization. Then, a few centuries later, you have King Henry VIII of England. Now, the historical irony here is just absolutely astounding. You have a king who is so desperate for a male heir that he inadvertently triggers a massive continental religious earthquake, all just to secure divorce. His decision to break away from the Roman Catholic Church to establish the Church of England was a deeply personal, honestly somewhat selfish choice. But it radically modernized the English state and permanently severed their ties with Rome.
And, interestingly enough, we even see this kind of deep structural reform with rulers who are predominantly known for the sword. Remember Napoleon? We just talked about his military campaigns reshaping the entire map of Europe. But his longest-lasting legacy isn't actually about his battles at all. He also introduced the Napoleonic Code. These were profound, sweeping legal reforms that totally standardized the law. So why does this matter to us today? Because while Napoleon's empire eventually collapsed and his hard-fought borders were completely erased, his code survived. Today, it still remains the foundation of civil law in dozens of countries globally. It vividly proves that ideas encoded in law are far, far more durable than lines drawn by armies on a battlefield. So, bringing all of this together into our final section, the final historical legacy. What is the lasting impact of these human histories? Ultimately, the big takeaway from this explainer is that human history is shaped by a deeply complex, intertwined mix of both conquest and conscience. We look back at the sprawling, aggressive military ambitions of an Alexander the Great or a Genghis Khan. But then we also reflect on the profound philosophical redemption of an Ashoka the Great. We study the structural, the legal, and the religious reforms of leaders like Charlemagne, Napoleon, and Henry VIII. Their absolute greatest achievements, and for sure their most devastating mistakes, continue to echo through time. They serve as a really powerful reminder that the decisions made by a single leader at the absolute top truly do have the power to change the destiny of millions of people.
Which leaves us with one final, pretty heavy thought to consider today. After seeing how these historical figures left their completely unforgettable marks on the world, some by expanding borders with the sword, others by changing minds and laws with the pen, and some through a profound life-altering realization of peace, I have a question for you. If you were handed the keys to an empire today, would you conquer or would you reform? Thank you so much for exploring this with me, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.